Well, I think it was just more real. Back then everything was strictly kayfabe. We had separate dressing rooms. We ate at separate restaurants. You would never, ever see anybody in the ring like all the guys rehearse now their spots.
Jimmy Hart never forgave these 10 wrestlers. That is the claim you see over and over on wrestling channels across the internet. It sounds like the perfect story. A sweet, smiling old manager, quietly holding on to secret grudges for 40 years. Betrayals nobody ever knew about. Wounds that never healed. It is the kind of headline that makes you stop scrolling and click play. But before we count down these 10 names, there is something you need to know first. Jimmy Hart might be one of the kindest, most easygoing people the wrestling business has ever produced. So how did his name end up sitting next to the words "never forgive" at all? Let's find out. We are going to count down from 10 all the way to 1, and by the end, you will understand exactly how a story like this gets built. Think about how strange this actually is. Jimmy Hart spent 50 years standing next to some of the most dangerous, volatile, and outspoken personalities in the history of sports entertainment. He absorbed real punches thrown by real crowds. He stood ringside through steel chair shots, blood, chaos, and decades of shifting company politics. If anyone had a reasonable excuse to walk away bitter, it would be him. And yet, when you actually search for evidence of real anger in his own words, you come up almost completely empty. That gap between the dramatic headline and the actual man is exactly what this video is going to explore. This is not a story about defending Jimmy Hart against unfair criticism, because there is no real criticism to defend against once you look closely. It is simply a story about what actually happened, told honestly, using the same historical record these clickbait videos claim to be based on. The facts are all there. They have just been rearranged, one relationship at a time, into something far more sensational than the truth ever was. To understand any of this, you first have to understand who Jimmy Hart actually is, long before he ever stepped into a wrestling ring. Before wrestling, Jimmy Hart was already a star. In the 1960s, he was the lead singer of a band called the Gentrys. Their song "Keep On Dancing" sold over 1 million copies and climbed all the way into the Billboard Top 5 in 1965. That is not a small achievement. That is real, mainstream musical success, years before he ever picked up a wrestling microphone. That background gave Hart something almost no other wrestling manager had. He understood crowds. He understood rhythm, timing, and the feeling of a live audience reacting to a performance in real time. Long before he ever stood in front of a camera in an airbrushed suit, Jimmy Hart already knew how to make people feel something. That instinct would end up shaping the rest of his career. Consider what that earlier chapter of his life actually gave him. A touring musician spends years learning how to read a room, how to build momentum during a performance, and how to land a big moment at exactly the right time. Those are the same skills a great wrestling manager needs at ringside. When Jimmy Hart eventually made the jump from garage rock stages to wrestling arenas, he was not starting from zero. He was simply applying a set of performance instincts he had already spent years refining in front of paying, reacting crowds. That head start explains a great deal about why his character connected so immediately and so powerfully with wrestling audiences once he finally stepped into that world. His entry into wrestling came through a friend, not a stranger. That friend was Jerry the King Lawler. The two of them had gone to Treadwell High School together in Memphis, Tennessee. Years later, Lawler saw something in his old classmate. He saw a voice that could fill a building and a stage presence that could make people either cheer wildly or boo furiously. So Lawler brought him into the Continental Wrestling Association, first as a kind of promotional singer, and eventually as a manager. From there, Jimmy Hart became one of the most instantly recognizable figures wrestling has ever produced. The airbrushed suits covered in wrestlers' faces, the oversized megaphone, that high-pitched, screeching voice that could cut through an entire arena. Every part of that character was designed for one purpose: to make audiences furious. And it worked, night after night, for years. It is worth remembering just how much of that visual identity became a template for an entire generation of wrestling managers who came after him. The bright, flashy suit, the prop that amplified his voice above the crowd noise, the exaggerated theatrical reactions to every twist of a storyline. Countless managers who followed in later decades borrowed pieces of that same formula, whether they realized it or not. Jimmy Hart did not just perform a character during the Memphis years. He helped define what a certain type of wrestling manager was supposed to look and sound like, an influence that has quietly shaped the visual language of the entire industry ever since. But Hart's contribution to wrestling went far beyond yelling into a megaphone at ringside. Working alongside a composer named J.J. Maguire, Jimmy Hart wrote, arranged, and produced more than 100 wrestling entrance themes. If you have ever heard Shawn Michaels walk out to Sexy Boy, that theme came from Jimmy Hart. Ted DiBiase's unforgettable "It's All About the Money" also came from Jimmy Hart. So did the Legion of Doom's booming anthem, "What a Rush." So did the Hart Foundation's Hitman theme, and the Honky Tonk Man's strutting tune, "Cool, Cocky, Bad." Later, in WCW, Hart composed custom music for stars like Sting, the NWO Wolfpack, and Diamond Dallas Page. Think about that for a moment. This is a man who did not just manage some of wrestling's biggest stars, he also gave many of them the actual sound of their careers, the music fans still recognize instantly decades later. It is worth pausing on just how significant that musical contribution really was to the wrestling business as a whole. Entrance music is one of the most important tools a wrestling character has. It tells the audience how to feel the second a performer appears, before a single word gets spoken or a single move gets executed. Getting that music right can transform an average character into an unforgettable one. Jimmy Hart, because of his background as an actual recording artist, understood that better than almost anyone else working in the industry at the time. He was not simply attaching sound effects to entrances. He was composing genuine pieces of music, tailored specifically to each individual performer's personality, and many of those compositions have outlived the wrestlers who used them, still circulating today in highlight reels, compilation videos, and fan tributes decades after they were first written. It is a quieter kind of legacy than championship belts or main event matches, but in many ways it has proven just as lasting. And despite building all of that, despite decades in an industry famous for backstage tension, jealousy, and long-simmering resentments, Jimmy Hart carries a reputation that very few performers in wrestling history can match. People who worked alongside him describe him consistently the same way: humble, positive, unselfish. There are accounts of Hart helping local crews set up ring equipment at small independent shows, long after he had already become a national star. Fans who met him at conventions described someone warm, patient, and genuinely happy to be there. In a business where shoot interviews often turn into platforms for settling old scores, Jimmy Hart almost never appears in that kind of content. He simply does not have that reputation. He is, by nearly every account, one of the most well-liked men to ever walk through a wrestling curtain. On top of that, Jimmy Hart's own on-screen character makes him an especially easy target for this kind of video. His shrieking voice, his flashy airbrushed suits, his ever-present megaphone, all of it was built specifically to make audiences angry at him. That reaction was the entire design of the character. Decades later, viewers still subconsciously connect Hart's image with chaos and conflict, simply because that is exactly what his character was engineered to represent. So a video claiming he secretly hates 10 different wrestlers taps directly into that old, built-in emotional response, even though the real man behind the character was almost never associated with any of that hostility in his actual life. There is one more piece of this puzzle worth understanding before we start the countdown. Wrestling audiences today are not passive. They actively hunt for behind-the-scenes information, shoot interviews, and old backstage stories. That hunger has created an entire ecosystem of channels, built specifically to satisfy it. Some of these channels do excellent, careful work, drawing clear lines between storyline and reality. Others take a shortcut. They understand that most viewers will not fact-check a title before clicking, and that a strong emotional hook, even a false one, will still generate views, comments, and watch time. Once a video like that gets uploaded, it often gets copied, reworded, and re-uploaded by other channels chasing the same audience. Over time, an entirely fictional grudge can start to feel established, simply because it has been repeated so many times across so many different videos. This is worth understanding as a broader pattern, not just something specific to Jimmy Hart. Almost any beloved figure with a long, well-documented career in an emotionally charged industry can become the subject of this same kind of countdown video. The formula barely changes from name to name. Find a handful of real, dramatic-sounding moments from someone's public history. Strip away the surrounding context that explains what those moments actually were. Attach a title promising secret hatred, betrayal, or regret. Once you understand that formula, you start noticing it everywhere, and you start asking a much more useful question before clicking on any similar video in the future. Is this genuinely revealing something new, or is it simply repackaging old, already understood history using more dramatic language? Keep all of this in mind as we count down these 10 names, because it applies to almost every single one of them. Number 10 on this list is Macho Man, Randy Savage. Jimmy Hart managed Savage very early in his career, back during the Memphis CWA days, long before Savage became one of the biggest main event stars in the entire WWF. That early Memphis period mattered enormously for Savage's development. It was where he built the foundation of the character that would later make him a main event star on national television, and Jimmy Hart was part of shaping that early chapter alongside him. Savage was known for many things throughout his career, but one trait in particular stood out to people who worked with him. He was intensely protective of his personal circle. circle. He trusted very few people fully, and he guarded his professional relationships closely. Some retrospective videos take that protective, guarded nature and twist it into a claim that Savage and Hart eventually had some kind of falling out so severe that Hart never got over it. The real story is much simpler and far less dramatic. As both men's careers moved forward, their paths naturally separated. Savage rose into main event singles competition, becoming one of the most celebrated performers of his era. Hart, meanwhile, continued managing other heel factions and building his reputation as one of wrestling's premier managers. Growing apart professionally is not the same thing as a betrayal. In Hart's own interviews, he speaks about Savage with clear, genuine admiration. He has praised Savage's incredible work ethic and called him one of the most talented performers of his generation. There is no bitterness anywhere in Hart's own words about Randy Savage. There is only respect for a man he helped guide early in his career, back in Memphis, long before the bright lights of the WWF. It is worth pointing out how this kind of story gets built in the first place. Savage's real, well-documented guardedness with other people becomes the seed. A video creator does not need to invent anything new. They simply need to take that one true detail, attach Jimmy Hart's name to it, and let the audience's imagination fill in the rest. That pattern of taking a small, real detail and stretching it into something bigger repeats itself throughout this entire list, and the next name on the countdown shows it just as clearly. Number 9 takes us to Sid Vicious, who wrestled during this era under the name Sid Justice. In 1992, Sid was being built up as a dominant, monstrous heel in the WWF. Part of that push involved defeating a string of wrestlers who happened to be managed by Jimmy Hart. Week after week, fans watched Hart's stable get flattened by Sid in one squash match after another. It happened often enough, and consistently enough, that longtime fans still remember the pattern clearly today, which is exactly why it works so well as clickbait fuel decades later. Some modern videos take this pattern and suggest that Hart must have personally resented Sid for repeatedly derailing the momentum of the wrestlers under his management. But here is what was actually happening behind the scenes. This was a completely standard wrestling booking strategy. When a promotion wants to elevate a new top-level heel quickly, they often have that wrestler defeat several established acts in a row to build instant credibility with the audience. Jimmy Hart's wrestlers were simply part of that larger plan. There is no documented evidence anywhere suggesting Hart carried any personal resentment towards Sid because of it. He was doing exactly what his job required, following the script exactly as written, to help elevate one of the promotion's most valuable new attractions. This is one of the clearest examples on this entire list of how a simple win-loss pattern on television can be repackaged, decades later, as evidence of something it never actually was. But squash matches are one thing. Real backstage tension is another matter entirely. And that brings us to a story with genuine political stakes behind it. Number 8 moves us into the tangled world of backstage wrestling politics, and the name here is Ric Flair. When Jimmy Hart moved over to WCW in 1994 alongside Hulk Hogan, the roster quickly split into two very real, very distinct camps. On one side sat the wave of new arrivals connected to Hogan. On the other side stood the longtime WCW performers who had built their careers there, with Ric Flair standing as their most recognizable figure. This divide was genuine, and it shaped a great deal of what happened backstage during that era, influencing bookings, storylines, and even locker room seating for years afterward. Some sensational videos take this well-known divide and stretch it into a claim that Jimmy Hart personally carried deep hostility toward Ric Flair because of it. In reality, this friction existed at a much higher level, involving executives, top stars, and bookers fighting over position, spotlight, and direction of the company. Jimmy Hart, by nature, avoided that kind of conflict entirely. Throughout his time in WCW, and long afterward, Hart maintained a friendly, professional relationship with Ric Flair. Being aligned with different sides of a larger corporate divide is simply not the same thing as holding a personal grudge, and nothing in Hart's actual history suggests he ever treated Flair as an enemy. It is easy to see how a real, well-documented company divide gets misread by someone scrolling through clips today. The politics were genuine. The personal animosity attributed to Hart simply was not. From boardroom politics, we move now to something much more physical, a moment that has become almost the signature clip of this entire genre of video. Number 7 brings us to a name familiar to anyone who watched the WWF in the early 1990s, IRS, played by Mike Rotunda. IRS was one half of the villainous tag team Money Inc., alongside Ted DiBiase. In February of 1993, during a now famous WWF broadcast, IRS physically shoved Jimmy Hart down to the mat, just before his partner struck another wrestler with a steel briefcase. On television, in the moment, it looked shocking. It looked like a genuine, personal betrayal against a man who had trusted his partner completely. The image of that shove has been replayed so many times over the years that it has essentially become the defining visual for this entire genre of Jimmy Hart clickbait video. Clickbait videos love to use this exact clip as supposed proof that Hart never forgave IRS for turning on him that night. But this entire sequence was carefully choreographed. It was designed by WWF Creative for a very specific purpose: to finally turn Jimmy Hart into a fan favorite after years as one of wrestling's most reviled villains. Rotunda, playing IRS, was simply performing his assigned role as a heel, exactly as instructed. There is no record anywhere of Hart expressing any real personal anger toward him after the cameras stopped rolling. It was business, executed precisely as it was written on paper. Out of every clip on this list, this shove might be the single easiest moment for a content creator to misrepresent, simply because it looks so visually convincing on camera. That is exactly why it keeps getting reused in these videos, again and again, year after year. IRS did not act alone that night, though. His partner played an even bigger role in the storyline, and that role actually changed the entire direction of Jimmy Hart's career. Number 6 is the other half of Money Inc., $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase. This is the moment that actually kicked off Hart's transformation from despised villain to beloved fan favorite. DiBiase and IRS turned on an injured Brutus Beefcake during a match, and when Jimmy Hart tried to physically stop the assault, DiBiase shoved him to the canvas and ended their partnership right there on live television. It remains one of the most pivotal character turns of Hart's entire on-screen career, marking the exact moment audiences stopped booing him and started cheering for him instead. To a modern viewer scrolling through old clips out of context, this looks like the ultimate betrayal of trust. Some videos frame DiBiase as a man Hart could never possibly forgive, but away from the cameras, DiBiase and Hart were genuinely close. Hart wrote DiBiase's entrance theme, "It's All About the Money," which remains one of the most instantly recognizable songs in all of wrestling history. Over the years, the two men have appeared together repeatedly at Christian ministry events and wrestling conventions. Their real relationship, built away from television scripts, was defined by mutual respect and shared history, not by resentment of any kind. If Jimmy Hart genuinely resented Ted DiBiase for what happened on screen, it seems unlikely the two of them would still be sharing a stage together at community and ministry events decades later. There is one more person tied directly to that same night in February of 1993, the man whose injury actually set the entire storyline in motion. Number 5 is the man who was on the receiving end of that steel briefcase shot, Brutus the Barber Beefcake. In February of 1993, Beefcake was making his emotional return to WWF television after a horrific parasailing accident that had required extensive facial reconstructive surgery. Fans had waited a long time to see him back in the ring, which is exactly why the WWF chose this particular moment, his long-anticipated comeback, as the setting for such a dramatic angle. During his return match, IRS blindsided him with a brutal strike from a steel briefcase. In response, Jimmy Hart dramatically threw himself over Beefcake's body, shielding him from further harm while pleading with Money Inc. to stop the attack. It is an emotional, dramatic scene, and it is easy to understand why people scrolling through old footage today might mistake it for something genuinely real, but the entire angle was carefully scripted from start to finish. It existed specifically to make Jimmy Hart a sympathetic figure in the eyes of the audience, and to set up the return of Hulk Hogan, forming a team that would become known as the Mega Maniacs heading into WrestleMania 9. There was no real-world violence involved, and no lingering personal anger behind it. It was one of the most effective pieces of storytelling Hart was ever part of, not some traumatic memory he has carried with him. The image of Hart shielding an injured performer is powerful precisely because it was meant to be. That same emotional power is exactly why it gets recycled so often in videos claiming it reveals something sinister. Let's step back a few years now, away from Money Inc. entirely, to one of the longest and most successful partnerships of Hart's whole career. Number 4 is the Honky Tonk Man, one of the most successful heel characters of the late 1980s wrestling boom. Jimmy Hart managed him throughout his record-setting, 454-day reign as Intercontinental Champion, one of the longest title reigns in the company's history. That championship run remains one of the signature achievements of Hart's entire managerial career, and it happened specifically because the pairing worked so well on screen for such a long stretch of time. After their run together eventually came to an end, the Honky Tonk Man became well known in later years for blunt, often sharpshoot interviews criticizing other wrestlers from his career. Because of that reputation for controversial commentary, some videos lump Jimmy Hart in with the list of people Honky supposedly clashed with in real life. But Hart never took part in any of that shoot interview back and forth. In fact, he co-wrote the Honky Tonk Man's entrance theme, Cool, Cocky Bad, and has spoken positively for years about his former client's in-ring skill and business sense. Simply being associated historically with someone known for controversial interviews does not automatically mean you were ever part of that controversy yourself. Guilt by association is one of the easiest tricks in this genre of video. If one half of a famous pairing has a reputation for conflict, it becomes tempting to assume the other half must share in it, even when the actual record says otherwise. Speaking of famous pairings, Honky Tonk Man was not the only tag team partner Jimmy Hart guided through a dramatic image change during this same period. Number 3 is Greg the Hammer Valentine. In the late 1980s, Jimmy Hart managed Valentine as part of a tag team called Rhythm and Blues, teaming him with the Honky Tonk Man. The gimmick required Valentine, a wrestler known for a far more serious, old-school style and reputation, to dye his hair jet black and adopt a flashy, musically themed persona completely unlike anything he had done before. It was a bold departure for a performer who had spent years building a much tougher, more traditional image, which is exactly why the transformation stood out so much to fans watching at the time. According to accounts from that era, Valentine actually resisted the gimmick at first, before eventually agreeing to go along with it. When the tag team eventually broke up in 1991, Valentine turned on Hart on screen as part of the storyline, specifically targeting his signature megaphone during the angle. Some retrospective videos take this on-screen breakup, combined with Valentine's early hesitation about the gimmick itself, and frame it as clear evidence of a real personal rift between the two men. The actual history tells a very different story. Hart and Valentine remained close, lifelong friends well beyond their time working together on screen. The clearest possible proof of that friendship came in 2004, when Greg Valentine personally selected Jimmy Hart to induct him into the WWE Hall of Fame. That is simply not something you do for someone you privately resent. When you look for the actual proof point, the moment where the truth becomes undeniable, it rarely comes from an old promo clip. It comes from something quieter, like a Hall of Fame induction, chosen freely, decades after the cameras first rolled on their storyline. Now we travel back further, before the WWF years entirely, to the story that many longtime fans consider the strangest and most fascinating of Jimmy Hart's whole career. Number 2 brings us to one of the strangest and most talked about chapters in all of wrestling history, Andy Kaufman. During Kaufman's now legendary Memphis wrestling run in the early 1980s, the Hollywood comedian aligned himself with Jimmy Hart specifically to stir up the local crowd even further. It was an unusual pairing from the very start, a mainstream comedian and a wrestling manager working together to create one of the most talked about angles of the entire decade, and it succeeded far beyond what anyone in Memphis likely expected at the time. Their promotional segments together were loud, chaotic, and full of shouting matches broadcast on local television. Taken completely out of context today, these old clips can look like real, unfiltered hatred boiling over in front of a live camera. Some channels present them exactly that way, as though the cameras had accidentally caught something genuine. But in real, authentic interviews given long after the fact, Jimmy Hart speaks about Andy Kaufman with obvious respect and admiration. He has repeatedly praised Kaufman's total commitment to his outrageous character, along with his willingness to absorb real, genuine anger from confused fans, who had no idea the entire thing was an elaborate performance art project. Hart has described the whole Kaufman program as one of the most fascinating and memorable creative experiences of his entire career, not something he ever resented or wished had never happened. Of all 10 stories on this list, the Kaufman angle might be the easiest one to misread, simply because it was designed from the very beginning to blur the line between performance and reality. It worked so well on 1980s audiences that it still works on modern viewers today, just for a different reason. That leaves us with one final name, the one relationship woven through every single other story on this list, and the one where Jimmy Hart's entire journey in professional wrestling truly began. And that finally brings us to number 1, the relationship where Jimmy Hart's entire wrestling career actually began, Jerry the King Lawler. This is the man who first brought Hart into the wrestling business, and their story together is really where this entire countdown should end. It is fitting that the person most closely tied to every video claiming Hart never forgives is also the very same person who gave him his career in the first place. After Lawler recruited him into the Memphis territory in the late 1970s, the two of them briefly worked together as on-screen partners. Then, by design, bookers split them apart, turning Hart into the leader of a villainous group called the First Family, a stable built with one explicit mission: destroying Jerry Lawler. For years afterward, their televised rivalry packed arenas across the region with violent, bloody, unforgettable matches. Some content creators today isolate old promotional clips from this era, moments where a furious-sounding Jimmy Hart vows on camera to run Lawler out of Memphis forever, and present these clips as unscripted proof of genuine, real-world hatred between the two men. In truth, Lawler and Hart were close personal friends throughout this entire period. They built this legendary rivalry together, on purpose, specifically because they both understood it would sell tickets, and it absolutely did, for years on end. Jimmy Hart has said many times, in his own words, that he owes his entire wrestling career to Jerry Lawler's early belief in him back in Memphis. Of every single name on this list, Lawler is the person Hart is most closely and permanently connected to, not the person he secretly resents the most. It is almost fitting that the relationship at the very center of Jimmy Hart's entire career is the one most often twisted into the most dramatic-sounding grudge of all. The bigger and more important the real friendship, the more convincing the fake version of it can be made to look on screen. So there you have it. 10 wrestlers, 10 dramatic-sounding stories. And when you actually dig into the real history behind each one, not a single genuine grudge among them. Every name on this list represents a moment of outstanding television, carefully built by professionals who trusted each other enough to make millions of fans believe it was completely real. That, honestly, is the entire point of professional wrestling as an art form. The very best angles are the ones you still remember decades later, the ones that still work on you emotionally even now, even after you already know how the business operates behind the curtain. Look back at the pattern across all 10 stories, and something becomes very clear. Every single one starts with a real, documented moment from wrestling history. A shove, a squash match, a tag team breakup, a political divide. None of these details were invented. The facts checked out every single time. What changed in each case was the interpretation layered on top of those facts. A scripted shove becomes a real betrayal. A booking decision becomes a personal insult. A business separation becomes an unforgivable act. The raw material is always genuine. The conclusion drawn from it is where the fiction actually begins. Notice, too, that the 10 names on this list span nearly Jimmy Hart's entire career, from his very first steps in Memphis all the way through his final years in WCW. That is not a coincidence. Jimmy Hart never needed 10 grudges to build an incredible career. His legacy was never constructed on hatred, resentment, or bitterness held quietly for decades. It was built on music, on performance, and on relationships that, in almost every single case explored here, turned out to be genuine, lasting friendships once the cameras finally stopped rolling. It is worth sitting with why these videos keep getting made in the first place. Nobody making them is necessarily trying to deceive anyone maliciously. Most of the time, it comes down to something much simpler than that. A dramatic title performs better than a calm one. A thumbnail that promises betrayal earns more clicks than a thumbnail that promises a heartwarming story about a lifelong friendship. Once you understand that incentive, you start to see it everywhere in modern wrestling content. Not just in videos about Jimmy Hart. Old rivalries get rebranded as real feuds. Business decisions get rebranded as personal betrayals. Professional disagreements get rebranded as lifelong hatred. None of it requires the creator to lie outright. It only requires leaving out the context that would make the real story less shocking. That is exactly what happened here. 10 real historical relationships, each one rooted in genuine professional history, got filtered through a title designed purely to provoke strong emotion. Strip away that filter, and what you find underneath is actually a much more remarkable story than the one promised by the thumbnail. You find a man who spent 5 decades in one of entertainment's most volatile industries, and somehow came out the other side with his reputation not just intact, but genuinely glowing. You find a performer who made a career out of pretending to be someone audiences should hate, while quietly being one of the people his peers respected the most. There is a certain irony in all of this worth sitting with for a moment. Jimmy Hart spent his entire career convincing audiences to feel real anger toward a completely fictional character. He was brilliant at it. That is precisely why, decades later, a new generation of content creators can convince audiences to feel that same anger all over again, this time aimed at Hart himself instead of the wrestlers he managed. The tool being used is the same one Hart himself mastered on television for 50 years. Manufactured emotion, presented convincingly enough that the audience forgets to ask whether any of it actually happened. The difference is that Hart always knew he was performing. Today's viewer, scrolling through a countdown video, often does not. Maybe that is the most useful lesson to take away from all of this, beyond just the story of one wrestling manager. The next time any video, about any public figure, promises secret grudges, hidden hatred, or lifelong bitterness, it is worth pausing before accepting the premise at face value. Ask where the claim actually comes from. Ask whether the underlying footage was ever scripted in the first place. Ask whether the person's own words, in their own interviews, support the story being told about them, or contradict it entirely. In the case of Jimmy Hart, that simple pause reveals a much better story than the one the algorithm wants you to believe. It reveals 50 years of genuine friendship, professional respect, and a reputation that has somehow stayed remarkably clean in an industry not exactly famous for clean reputations. It reveals a man who spent his whole career making audiences believe something that was not true, and who somehow still comes out, on the other side of it all, as one of the most trusted and beloved figures the business has ever known. So the next time you come across a video promising secret wrestling grudges and long-hidden hatred, remember this list. Remember that the loudest, most dramatic headline is very rarely the truest one. And remember that sometimes the quieter, more honest story, the one built on respect, gratitude, and 50 years of genuine goodwill, ends up being the far better story all along.